Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening, Goeienaand and Shalom, people. Welcome to another episode of Liberty and Friends, your Sunday evening easy viewing here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. My name is Usihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty, coming to you from the southern tip of Africa. Welcome to it. Please, guys, as you're streaming in, hit that like button. Show me some appreciation, please. Those likes really help the show get out to a much wider audience. I don't know what it does to the social media algorithm, but it definitely does help spread the show far and wide. Welcome to it once again. My name is Sihle Ngobese. As always on Liberty and Friends, we have exactly that, Big Daddy Liberty and his friends, the panel who changes every week, that provides that compelling analysis that you'll get nowhere else except here on Liberty and Friends. So welcome to it. I will in a moment introduce that panel. Tonight on Liberty and Friends, we will really focus on international news because really it dominated the news week that was. What am I talking about in particular? Well, the geopolitical storm that is brewing in Europe at the moment, where Russia has opted to invade the country of Ukraine. There's a lot of dynamics around that. And it brings in nearly all of the world's superpowers, including the United States of America with its one Joe Biden, who now needs to actually show some strength or resolve in the situation in terms of assisting in ushering in, peace. Because I assure you of this, where there are weak leaders and there is an appearance, of weakness on the international stage, the hyenas will come out looking for their pound of flesh. For instance, what will the situation in not the Ukraine, but Ukraine and Russia mean, for instance, in terms of the politics between China and Taiwan? We will unpack all of those issues and more tonight on Liberty and Friends with the Friends panel. Speaking about the Friends panel, let me bring them on. As I can see them waiting in the lobby here. There he is, Nicolas Lorimer, of course, from Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree. That's a podcast on the Daily Friend. Nicolas, good evening.
How's it, Sihle? Good to be here.
Hey, man, good to have you. As I just switch these around. Good to have you, Nick. Super appreciate your time. Another face who you definitely appreciate and recognize also, the other half of the Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree and a head honcho at one of the campaigns at the Institute of Race Relations, who is Gabriel Crouse. There he is. Gabriel, good evening.
How's it, Sihle? Very lucky to be here. How's it, Nick? Nick and I should say, have had quite a few episodes about Two Crickets in the Thorn Tree, and we sometimes have to end the thing after 2 hours before we start pulling each other's beard hairs out. So no.
Well, here's to hoping that some of that definitely plays out here tonight. Speaking about someone who is an expert on playing some of these, or teasing rather, some of these issues out, Hugo Kruger, there he is, the one person actually coming from the continent of Europe, so literally facing danger to an extent. Hugo, good evening.
Yes, thank you. South Africa might soon look to be a safer place than Europe. If things continue this way.
Hey man, as long as that nuclear dust, what is it called, doesn't come our way, I'll be happy.
Mushroom clouds. We'll talk about that because there is a nuclear risk in Ukraine that is overlooked, and it's not just Chernobyl, by the way. But we'll get to it.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely get into that. Welcome to it. That's Hugo Kruger, of course, writer and analyst and an engineer out in France. Shout out to him for joining us tonight. Here's a chap who you haven't seen in a while. Rob Duigan. I last spoke to him when I was actually in Durban, if I'm not mistaken, and a snake rolled into the space I was in. What is with snakes and rolling into my coverage? Rob Duigan, Putwami, good evening. You're muted, Rob. Try us again.
Sorry. How are you doing?
Dude, very good to have you on. How have you been?
No, I'm all right. I'm cooking here in Wellington because it's about 40 degrees, and I've got no aircon, but otherwise doing fine.
Well, Rob sounds like he's in Mogadishu. Welcome to it. Just kidding. Someone who probably has been to Mogadishu, very well traveled, very well versed on all things, really, to an extent, given where he cut his teeth, military science, the retired colonel, of course, and the host of the Chris White Africa show, Upra Chris White. There he is. Chris, hello.
Hey, how's it? Chile, Dumalang, South Africa. Folks, I'm only here for about another 34 minutes, and I've got to head out because Don Trump Jr. is giving the final speech here at the Conservative Political Action Convention, which I'm attending in Orlando, Florida. So I'm with you for about 34 more minutes.
Dude, we really appreciate it. Welcome to it. And perhaps let's get straight into it in that regard. And I must begin here because, just before we came online, guys, I made the point that this issue is clearly just taken over the news cycle. Be damned the spicy cough, be damned lockdowns and anything else really that was dominating the news cycle. This conflict between, or really the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine has dominated the news cycle. Gabriel, I'll begin with you. There's a conversation to be had here around, for a lot of people who are not paying attention, this was a surprise.
I'll tell you, it was a surprise for people who were paying attention as well. So in this instance, and in some regards, I should include myself. I just earlier today watched a panel of Princeton University historians and international analysts, half of whom had been assuring the world a week ago that there would be no invasion in the face of what American and UK intelligence had been saying. I myself had said on the last episode of Two Crickets and a Thorn Tree a week ago that there would be an invasion, but that it would only happen in a year. So I thought, no, they'll do it next winter. Some people got it wrong, maybe by looking too closely and losing the wood for the trees. But I think people from the outside, Ukraine and Russia are faraway places. They're cold, frosty people, famous for drinking too much and something to do with the Cold War. Who knows what? What's happened is a buildup that has really been coming a long way. There's been war in the Ukraine, a kind of civil war since 2014. At that point, a pro-Russian president was ousted in a coup, an insurrection that led to his illegal removal. And that led to the people in Crimea saying, we don't respect this government anymore. And Russian troops getting in there, overseeing a referendum in which most people in Crimea said, we want to leave Ukraine, join Russia. Then there was on the eastern border of Ukraine, a similar thing in Donetsk, a similar thing in Luhansk. That general border region is called the Donbass. I know it's all in a different language. But those guys said, we also aren't really happy with being in Ukraine. They got rid of our pro-Russian. He was a Ukrainian, but he liked Russia. They got rid of him and replaced him with a guy who liked America and Europe, and we're not into that, and we don't want to be in this country. And so then there was a bit of a civil war, and without getting into too many of the details, the point is that thing has not been resolved in the last 8 years, since 2014. And Russia's version is that it's getting in there to finish the civil war, and the Ukrainian president's version, Volodymyr Zelenskyy versus Vladimir Putin, the two Vlads in a way. Volodymyr Zelenskyy's version is, look, this is just a complete illegal, ridiculous colonial imperial invasion. These guys are just trying to turn all of Ukraine into another province of Russia. So you've got those two different narratives in the very basic form, and people are killing each other because war is sort of a way. It's ultimately a testing ground of truth. But it comes with a lot of lies, and the truth that's going to be resolved is not necessarily who's morally right or morally wrong, but it's gonna be about who's more powerful and who's got the ability to set the agenda for what is to come. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's worth attending. Besides the human interest stories of people that are suffering and people that are fighting there are going to be ramifications for the rest of the world, because there really is not a lot that's been exactly like this. And so that truth of who rules the day, that specific kind of truth, is going to have an impact, I think, around the rest of the world, even though often it comes with a lot of lies, Anyway.
I want to come to Hugo and then Chris in a moment, because again, Hugo, you're in continental Europe at the moment.
Right.
I think the first element I want us to all chew on generally is how the media broadly has approached this issue, because Gabriel raised the notion of truth and how difficult, from my perspective, as I was doing the research for the show, to decipher what is what. What is truth, what is fiction, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Two questions for you, Hugo. In your part of the world, France right now, how is this news being received by the public there? And what are you seeing the political elites in your part of the world say about the conflict?
Okay, so I'll just compare it to the rest of the world. I think the English press, particularly in the UK, has been atrocious. American press has been, depends which one you read. I think a little bit. You can find balance if you read both sides, right? That's always the case in the US press. In France, it's been a bit more balanced and nuanced, I would say. And I'm actually quite impressed the way the French approach it. And the reason is it's elections coming up here. And there's basically two camps. Macron is running on I would say, a reluctantly pro-NATO campaign. And then you've got, he's running against Eric Zemmour. And Zemmour is basically saying, sorry, guys, if I'm elected, I'm going to make a clear statement, Ukraine cannot join NATO. And France basically holds the cards, I would say, on Ukraine's NATO membership. France and Germany, to some extent, they've always opposed it historically. It's a very complicated issue, I would say, to begin with, because if you look at Europe geographically, the path towards Russia has always been France, Germany, Poland, and then you can choose either Belarus or Ukraine, and you end up in Russia. And that's been the path that Hitler and Napoleon took. So you can see from the Russian point of view that those are the buffer states, right? And the more they get militarized closer to our border, the more our security is warned. But if you inverse that, you also see that setup benefits France, because France doesn't want to arm Germany, and we don't want particularly hostile Russia on the Ukrainian border. So you find that the geopolitical ambitions of France are slightly different than the US in this regard. And my theory has been that because the UK has left the EU, there's been a realignment of balance in the European Union. The French and the Germans are playing a more proportionate role. And today, for the first time since the Second World War ended, the Germans have toyed with the idea of rearming themselves. As you all remember, after the Second World War, the Germans said they won't have an army anymore. It was kind of imposed on them by the Americans. Now, for the first time, they are saying they're going to increase their GDP spending on military. So this, why Ukraine is so important, and I go back to the work of Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor of Jimmy Carter, and he played an enormous role in formulating US foreign policy during the Cold War. He wrote a famous piece in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard. And in this Grand Chessboard, he said Ukraine is what separates Russia from being a European power and a Eurasian power. If Ukraine is part of the European Union, if it's part of NATO, Russia is only a Eurasian giant. If Ukraine falls into Russia's orbit, Russia becomes both a Eurasian and a European power. So you can already see there's massive geopolitical interest into this question. And I think I'll end there and give Chris a chance, because I know he's got a lot to say on this as well. That is sort of the grand, bigger picture. Okay, and then just to add on top of that, I don't think this started in 2014, it started in 2008, I would say, with Georgia, really. But, for practical purposes, we can say there was a CIA-instigated coup d'etat in 2014 under the Barack Obama presidency. And because of the coup d'etat since then, Russia has always been worried about a puppet regime on its border states. It will see Ukraine as a puppet regime. Yeah.
Well, Chris, I must bring you in here because, again, you're hearing that famous involvement, if you will, of the United States, often through regime change type policies. And often, that expression of blowback comes back out. We've heard it in the context of the Middle East and, the involvement of the US there. But, Hugo brings up that element insofar as this conflict right now. The US and its fingerprints are all over this, are they not?
Well, I wouldn't say all over it. That's one reason why we have a conflict, because we're not all over it. That's part of the problem. Weak leadership leads to consequences, and that's what we're dealing with. But a couple things very quickly. Gabriel did a great job of kind of synopsizing, giving a short history of kind of where we're at. It's more complicated, but I think it was and I know he knows the detail, but for brevity's sake, he did a really good job of that. And Hugo's comments are fair. The U.S. was involved in regime change in the Ukraine, and was that a wise idea? I didn't think so at the time, but of course I was serving intelligence officer. Not my place to say. It wasn't illegal. It may have been immoral, but it wasn't illegal. A few other quick notes about this before I get off the mic. The Germans were very serious, Hugo. Contrary, I disagree with your point there. They were serious about defense, and I disagree with the argument that they had to be convinced to create the Bundeswehr. And it was actually the Germans, many in the German government, who wanted to defend themselves and join NATO because they feared the Soviet Union. Now, people think that the Warsaw Pact predated NATO. It didn't. NATO came first in 49, and then the Warsaw Pact came later. But anyway, the Germans had 500,000 people in arms and heavily armed armored divisions throughout Germany, and there were German garrisons everywhere in 1990. And then, like little pantyweights, they started dismantling, went down to force 170,000. And they, under successive CDU and SPD governments, have failed to fund the military, but they used to spend over 3% of GDP, 3.5%, 4% of GDP back in the 70s and 80s. So they clearly cared about it when there was a Cold War, but they have retrenched from that a lot. Very quickly about this conflict, let me warn folks that don't know much about Ukraine and those who think they know a lot about it. First off, be very careful about what you see on social media. I've seen people circulating videos of a crucifixion that took place 6 years ago and claiming that it's happening today, and people talking about this and that and the other. Also, you see these so-called experts that come on these networks and write these articles in newspapers, and the Russian forces are disorganized. They failed to take Kiev and this, that, and the other. If you've never marched in a convoy with 400,000 armored vehicles or 100,000 armored vehicles and wheeled vehicles and getting fuel and moving and coordinating movements in a multi-pronged offensive, you really don't have a position to talk from unless you can appreciate the complexity of that. I'm not shilling for the Russians. I'm not saying they're doing well. I'm not saying they're doing poorly. But because Russian forces, a tank ran out of gas, suddenly the Russians are incompetent. They're not capable of doing things. Maybe they are, but that's not the indicator for it. There's a lot more to it. So I caution people listening to coffee table analysis from so-called experts who get paid a lot of money to look pretty in front of a camera or be brought on the camera. None of us are being paid, so that doesn't include us. We don't get paid for this. Anyway, but my point is that be very careful about what you see on social media, and be very careful about what people are telling you about what's going on. Listen to people, and then do a little simple research on your own. It's so easy to do. Two things going around. This is unrelated to this. Give me two examples very quickly of why this can be dangerous. Right now, the internet is ablaze with the story that Tamara Lish has committed suicide in prison in Canada. Now, that hasn't been confirmed by anybody. That is all blowing up all over the place. She is the one who organized the Freedom Rally convoy in Canada with the GoFundMe, or as I call them, Go Fraud Me, and then Give, Send, Go. She was not in prison, so this was news to me that she's in prison. She committed suicide. Maybe she was rearrested. I don't know. Point is that it's blowing up. People are taking at face value. They're getting all emotional. Same thing in the Ukraine. This person killed this person, that person killed, this is going on. What we do know is the following, and then I'll wrap up. We do know that today the Russian forces Putin put his nuclear forces on high alert. Nuclear forces are always on alert, but putting them on high alert is a political statement and a threat to the West. Also, we know that yesterday, Putin took the dramatic and unnecessary and I think foolish political decision to threaten neutral actors. He threatened Finland, Sweden, Austria, and Switzerland, telling them if they move economically or politically or militarily towards NATO, there would be consequences. And Finland will not take that lightly. If anything, that's likely to convince some parliamentarians it's time to discuss this issue of NATO membership seriously, in which it wasn't really being discussed seriously in the capitals, in Helsinki, in Stockholm, in Vienna, or in Switzerland. Switzerland never join anything. Austria is unlikely to. Sweden might consider it. Finland might look very seriously now. It's a foolish move. So nuclear forces alert. The Germans have done 180 degrees on the SWIFT, which is this communications network for banking transactions that allows them to sell oil in the marketplace. By the way, United States, energy independent 13 months ago under Voldemort, the name we dare not speak, Trump, who spoke here last night for an hour and a half. I was present. I was up on the platform where he was booing the media. I was one of the media up there. Those guys, fake media, I was one of them. Anyway, so I was here last night, and 13 months ago, energy independence, largest oil producer in the world, beating Saudi Arabia, largest energy producer in the world. And now we buy 595,000 barrels a day from Russia. That's $55 million at $93 a barrel, which is all done through SWIFT transactions. That is already $225 million he's made off of oil since he started this conflict 4 days ago. So I just caution people to be very careful. So we know that as well. The Germans have turned around and left Sleepy Joe in his nightgown and his sleeping cap, drinking his hot cocoa, And he is behind now because he's not calling for swift sanctions. But the Germans have turned around and said swift sanctions. And they're the ones going to feel it first because natural gas will be turned off. It might have already been turned off because some pipelines have been burned up. And one last thing on this. When I did 3 broadcasts on Wednesday, not tooting my own horn, 3 broadcasts, and including Ronaldo's program, flew to Orlando, got to my hotel, a snafu with their computer system, finally got my room 1:30 in the morning, unpacked my suitcase, can't sleep, turned the TV on, and the invasion has started. I spent 3 hours online explaining to people what's going on while Sleepy Joe was in bed with his slippers, you know. He couldn't be bothered as leader of the free world to come out and speak to the world and tell them what's going on. And this is why this conflict happened. There's a lot more to it. The bottom line is American weakness, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, feckless foreign policy, a weak position which we're dependent on Tehran and Russia and many other things. Worthless leadership has put us where we are today, and Joe is directly responsible. I call this Putin and Biden's conflict, and that's what I'm going to call it throughout, because people are dying, children, adults, infrastructure being destroyed because these idiots, when leadership is weak, this is what you get, and that's what we have right now. Thanks.
Well, Chris, I'm not going to let you go
Okay.
quite yet because I want to.
Well, I didn't want to hog the mic all day because I can do that. I do 5-hour streams.
I want you to unpack a few things here because, you know, I think there's something to be said about 2 things. And again, I just want to remind everybody, we need to frame this conversation in a way in which anybody who's watching and maybe wasn't paying attention to either the corporate media or just social media, I want them to understand the context of what's happening in this conflict. So let me go back. Joe Biden, in the run-up to the last election, was full of bluster, Chris. Here's a guy who was saying, you know what, Trump has been very friendly, playing nice with Vladimir Putin. I used to be a street brawler in Delaware. They know me. What's his face? Vladimir Putin will fear me when he comes. Well, in this case, that's Biden. When I come into power, then he saw a situation where clearly Putin doesn't fear the U.S. or doesn't fear the U.S. under Biden at least, because here's a man who's invading the Ukraine. And it isn't just, Chris, it isn't just those separatist regions that we were often told would be, you know, he'd want to, what's the word?
The irredentist regions, yeah.
You know, have a show of force because they're independent, and he wants to inculcate that, of course. This man is going after the capital of the Ukraine in Kiev. Clearly, U.S. power is waning, Chris. And I'm sorry to frame it that way. I know you're a patriot to a large extent, but let's call a spade a spade. There's simply no fear at all or no deterrence from the U.S. at the moment.
Well, let me reframe that. I wouldn't say U.S. power is waning. We've heard this story before, only to be disproved. So, for instance, in 1979, America was a disaster. We're on the decline. Japan's on the rise, going to surpass the U.S. Yada yada yada. Didn't happen. Reagan came in office and restored this country on a path. Now, his late terms, you know, he wasn't well and some things happened. But anyway, he restored us. Then Clinton comes in. People don't know what's going on in the world. The U.S. is the unipolar power. And then 9/11, the U.S. is on the wane, and we come back strong. The problem is leadership. It's as simple as that, is leadership. Everything is in place for the United States to be the most powerful and the most influential nation in the world. We simply refuse to do it because we've elected a cabal of leftist losers, absolute losers. It's just, you know, so this was fixed almost overnight. Whether you liked him or not, Voldemort, as I call him, the name you dare not mention, Donald Trump, this guy overnight turned this country around and on a path where people fear. Remember, he came in office, he's starting a nuclear war with North Korea. Actually, he's the only president since the end of the Cold War that actually got North Korea to do something that we wanted them to do. Stop firing intermediate range nuclear missiles over the Sea of Japan and Japanese airspace, and that's an act of war. They stopped doing it. Why? He stroked little Kim's ego. That's all it took. Now, that wasn't a complete solution, but that was a start. That's all it took. That's what he wanted. He wanted recognition. And his policy with Russia was hamstrung by the fake Russia collusion narrative bought and paid for by the corrupt Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee interfering in our politics, and it distracted our foreign policy for 3 years. But what did Putin not do? Under Obama, he invaded and annexed the Crimea, stole it, the most important strategic piece of the Ukraine without question, and took control of it. Yeah, that's mostly Russians there, but that isn't germane. That isn't the point. So he did it. And what did Obama and Biden do? A few little weak sanctions. That's it. Accomplished nothing. Under Trump, did he invade? No. Could he have invaded? Sure. Did he have these forces available? Yes. But for 4 years, he didn't do it because he respected and feared Trump. And even if it wasn't that, he took the calculus that Trump is serious and he'll do something if we mess with him. He knows Biden is weak. He's a coward. He's a fool. He's a plagiarist. He's a pathological liar, and he's inept, and he's also, quite frankly, demented. So, I mean, hopefully they keep the nuclear football away from the guy. I'm worried that because the Russian force on high alert, Joe wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and try to turn the alarm off and hit the button of nuclear, hit the wrong button. So anyway, but American power is not waning. American power is not waning. I've heard this argument throughout my life, and every time America comes back better and stronger. But I will tell you this, the socialists and Marxists in our midst are undermining everyone, including America. They are like an acid corroding our infrastructure. The superstructure of our liberty and democracy are destroying and crumbling, and we can't make decisions that are important for the world. Now, this sounds very American, very egotistical, and very American-centric. And you're right, it is. And you know why? Because I'm correct. Without America's leadership, the world is rudderless. Sorry, it's just the way it is.
Let's test that. And I want to come to Robert here.
Sure.
Robert, there's two questions before I ask you to respond to anything you may have heard that you want to respond to. What I found really funny about this topic is that almost immediately, Rob, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, people started setting up moral positions that if you don't tweet this way, if you don't say this, then you are a Vladimir Putin bought spy. By goodness, I was accused on social media of being paid for by Vladimir Putin, and I made a funny little jab, and I said, well, yeah, absolutely. Just the other day, I was with Putin playing golf, and we spoke about the modern proliferation of food poisoning claims made to wealthy homeowners. Again, I was making fun of it, but it's funny to see how people have just almost frothed at the mouth to say you must support this position because of XY, or this position because of XYZ. And worse yet, Rob, and I want you to speak to this, they've created almost a left-right dichotomy where if you say anything about Putin, which isn't negative, then you're on the right. And if you say something that is in support of the Ukraine, then you're broadly on the left, the sort of Biden side, and blah blah blah. Your thoughts, Rob, as this thing descends into these talking points?
Well, it's very funny because I don't think it actually fits very neatly into left or right. I mean, for example, the really hard right-white nationalists are actually Ukraine supporters. I mean, for example, Richard Spencer, he's a Ukraine supporter. And there's some odd little connections, like a number of the sort of silly buggers who got caught after coming back from training camps in Ukraine, in the United States, in the last couple of years. They share training with the Azov Battalion, who, the thing is, the America's security branches have been doing silly business, like training far-right militia groups in Ukraine in preparation for Russian invasion, and kind of the result is that they've created this funny nexus where people from all over the show have shown up in Ukraine to get military training. And there's even a connection there with, what's that bugger's name who shot up the mosque in New Zealand? I can't remember his name now, but he had connections with him as well. So there's a lot of sort of funny business happening in the background, and I think that I suspect that a lot of the different branches of various Western governments are not talking to each other very, very well. But one of the things that actually stunned, I think, everybody is that, and I think this is partially why everyone's reaction has been so all over the show, is that American intelligence, what they were reporting into the public, was for the first time in years something that was actually true. What we've seen from the usual trust the experts narrative has almost universally been sort of either open lies or very, very slipshod bullshit. And all of a sudden, everything they said, down to the very hour that the invasion was going to be launched, was accurate. And I mean, I've heard some people, some of the sort of open intelligence guys that I follow on Twitter, who do this for a living, they said that the reason that Putin was so predictable is primarily because he's relying on sort of a very older model or an older warfare doctrine that's a little bit outdated. And so it's much more slow moving and less flexible. But I mean, the thing is, you get this sort of confirmation bias. So everyone who said, nah, Putin's not going to invade, America's bullshitting, whatever, they got blindsided. And the normal response from most people is actually kind of to double down, not to check themselves. And for me, I try to be very careful not to fall into that. So I didn't think that Putin was going to invade at all, precisely because it was what was predicted. So I thought, what kind of silly bugger would actually follow exactly what his enemies predict him to do? And it turns out that Putin is that kind of silly bugger. But yeah, I mean, there's some funny narratives over here that are going around that a lot of people miss. But I mean, I can touch on those later, maybe.
Yeah, I was about to say, let me put a quick bookmark there. We are at the 8:30 mark. We're 30 minutes into the show. One of our guests has to leave soon, so I will be a bit heavy in terms of giving him, a bite at the apple, so to speak. Welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. My name is Sihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. We're in conversation with Gabriel Crouse from the Daily Friend, and of course, the Institute of Race Relations, Hugo Kruger, writer and analyst, and of course, an engineer out in France, Robert Duigan, who of course is a writer. You'll find his stuff in quite a few places, but he's also with Afriforum now, if I'm not mistaken. Shout out to the boys out at Afriforum, or the guys rather at Afriforum. And of course, Colonel retired Chris Wyatt of the Chris Wyatt Africa show. Shout out to him, of course, for joining us on the show. Guys, I just wanted to give everybody that first bite at the cherry, but I think it's time we go into the meat and potatoes of this conversation. And I'm seeing people sort of scream it at me in the comment section. Guys, there's context here, and this is how I want to frame it as we open up the conversation. Broadly speaking, there's two narratives here. The one pushed by Putin, that actually, for as much as I look like the aggressor, I'm the victim, he suggests, because NATO, the North Atlantic, TO, guys, help me?
Treaty Organization.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Is pushing towards Russia, and their posturing is very violent. They're setting up all sorts of military hardware, blah, blah, blah. I'm the victim. I need to do something about this. The Ukraine offers me a buffer insofar as, we share a language, not a language, but like we share a custom, a history, and blah, blah, blah. And there are these two regions, guys, that are declaring independence. I want to support that independence because it also offers me a buffer. That's arguably almost in a very horrible way, a way of just me surmising this. The other side is that American/NATO side that says, well, to hell, we're a free world, and if a country wants to join NATO, by goodness, let them join. And the Ukraine is a fantastic country. It's a democracy in that part of the world, as we've heard them say often, time and time and again. And, we should support it. Chris, I'm going to come to you, then Hugo. But before I do that, a reminder to you, please, if you're watching the show, hit that like button. We've got a very strong audience tonight, but my likes are nowhere near where they should be. Just hit a like button. Do it right now. If you do it, if you hit that like button, you will feed a kid here in Africa. That kid is me. So please hit that like button. Chris, I must come to you. Broadly speaking, those are the two narratives. And indeed, if you look at how it plays out on social media, we're forced to take one side or the other. But where's the truth there to an extent, Chris? Is Putin the victim here who's simply responding to Western aggression?
Well, first off, before I answer that, I have to say that I just did an hour stream talking about Ukraine before this, and one of my viewers said 3.5 minutes in and you're already wrong. Bye. Well, okay, well, so long. I told you not to listen to my stream if you don't want to. You can get your information wherever the hell you want. But maybe y'all shouldn't listen to me. I'm just one of these viewers, apparently. Anyway, but seriously, no, Putin's not the victim here. He's playing the victim. He is an opportunist who's taking advantage of circumstances, a weakness stemming from Brussels and from Berlin and from Paris and London, and also from, most importantly, from Washington, D.C. He's taking advantage of things and trying to realize, a lot of people are talking about is he trying to restore the Soviet Union? Based on his public comments, he's trying to restore Tsarist Russia. I mean, I don't know if that's his real intent, but that's what he's saying. But the Ukrainians aren't innocent victims here. I mean, I'm talking about the politicians. I'm not talking about the Ukrainian people. I'm talking about Ukraine is hardly a good example of virtue and democracy. It's a democracy that has lots of problems, and not the least of which we've seen it play out over the last 8 years. No, Russia's not a victim here. They're just playing the role of victim, and it's a lot more complicated than just coffee table analysis. The people who are victims, the people, who are being subjected to this horror of being in a war, a wholly unnecessary, unwarranted, unjust war. And as I said before, it's Putin and Biden's war. Biden almost wanted this war. I mean, he did all the things you could possibly do to antagonize and piss off Putin. Let me ask you this question. Who takes 1,300 soldiers and sends them to Romania 1,800 kilometers from the nearest logistical point and reinforcement of U.S. troops? Look, a speed bump at best in Romania. Who puts 1,700 troops from Fort Bragg into Estonia? I mean, that's like 3 seconds from Russia. And that's not going to stop anybody. I mean, we can get a crowd of people together to overwhelm 1,700 soldiers in a demonstration. That's just stupid. He antagonized them instead of taking concrete, real steps or trying genuine diplomacy. I will say very quickly that Ambassador Rick Grenell, our former ambassador to the Germans, who don't like him very much. They supposedly love gay people, but not Rick Grenell. He's openly gay. Rick Grenell was a brilliant ambassador in Berlin because he called the frauds out in the German government for what they were. Rick Grenell gave a great speech here a couple days ago, or yesterday when it was, and he talked about the failure of our diplomacy. And he just hit one point after another and how we have amateurs in the State Department whom I've worked with in the past, and also the appointees are in the State Department and this administration who really have very little idea what they're doing and how to do proper negotiation. Putin respects strength, and they show weaknesses diplomatically, and they show weaknesses geopolitically. And that's why we're in this situation. And a lot of people run around here at this convention going, if Trump had been president, we wouldn't be in a war right now. That's a counterfactual. It may or may not be true, but I can tell you this. How many countries did Putin invade in the 4 years Trump was president, even with the Russia collusion narrative distracting our foreign policy and with frivolous lawsuits against Trump administration for every executive order he put out there? None. Not a single country. How many wars did Donald Trump start? None. He ended wars. Anyway, it goes on and on. So Putin is not a victim here. He is an instigator, and he's a bad guy.
Look, Hugo, I must come to you. There's quite a bit of head shaking and nodding at times. But even as I come to you, Hugo, I want to just frame a question, and then I'll let you outline anything you want to outline at that point. There's something to be said, though, about, if I mean, it's almost the last point that, as you know, let me take 2 steps back. And I want to go back to a comment made on here. Actually, and it's also something you had raised on the show when we first discussed this issue. Just give me a second here, Hugo. I want to scroll up and I'll actually put it on screen if I do find it. If I don't, I'll just freeball it here now. Someone actually asked, and I'm not finding it, as luck would be, would have it. Someone had actually asked, guys, unpack, please, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, these separatist regions. And I think what they were trying to get at in their question is, there's a broader context here, which, I wanted us to drill into, because people don't understand why suddenly there's a conflict. But you had said this, Hugo, before. These are old arguments, if you will, playing out, now flaring up as violence, but actually had found or had been vacillated in some way, even and ratified in certain agreements. Can you unpack those for us, Hugo, so that we can understand what's going on?
There's a lot going into this, and with any of these conflicts, you don't know when to start the clock. That's usually the problem. Do I start it in 2014 when the Yanukovych government was toppled? Do I start it in 2008 when Russia invaded South Ossetia in defense of Georgia, who wanted to join NATO? Do I start it at the end of the Cold War or do I start it when Ukraine was a sort of a special arrangement for the Soviet Union? So you can go back in time to whichever point in history you want to be, and that's that's often what these discussions end up being. The way I look at it is this: I say, okay, for sensible purposes, let's start it in 2014. That's sort of a basis. Yanukovych was overthrown. Now, Yanukovych was not a clean person. He was certainly not a Democrat, anything of that sort. I always say he made Jacob Zuma look like Transparency International. That's pretty much how corrupt he was. So, that is what you deal with in that part of the world to begin with. Now, to understand Ukraine, I think South Africans get this instinctively. You have, unless you studied at WITS or UCT, where you truly believe that we are a no race, no culture, no language country. But anyone who looks at a map of South Africa, and whether you look at language or whether you look at race or whether you look at ethnic origin, will realize that something is going on. And that's sort of the same thing in Ukraine. The more you move to the left, you find more Ukrainian, and Ukrainians share a common history with the Poles, but there's also been some bad blood there. And the more you move to the right-hand side, to the Russian border, you find a more Russian-speaking part. And in the middle, there's interface. Some Ukrainians speak both languages, and it goes on and on. So when Yanukovych won the election, he came from the Donbass region. The region was under dispute. but he won primarily the votes in those part of the country, and then he won some percentage of the rest of the country. That's how he got elected. When he was toppled, the government came afterwards, the votes were inversed. So essentially you're sitting with a tribal country to begin with, right? So what happened in Donbass? Now, there's a lot of been talking about the Azov battalion, I believe, which was, I suppose, funded by the US as well, but I don't think they knew what they were doing, which is a neo-Nazi movement that has been shell gunning the Russian-speaking population on the basically on the Russian border for the last 8 years. And there's some horrible images online, and some of them is probably propaganda that I've seen. It's difficult in these times of people who were maimed and lost their legs, and it's quite ugly. So you can understand there's a lot of resentment from the Russian-speaking population. There was also a time when the Ukrainian government made a rule saying no more Russian in the country. Now, I think Afrikaners understand how that feels. You're going to get irritated with your government if they ban your language, right? So there has been oppression of the Russian-speaking minority. Now, you can understand why they will go to Big Brother Putin to come and rescue them, right? If that is the background that is in there. But at the same time, Russia has not been an honest broker, to say the least, as well. Putin just invaded the rest of the country, and he's not just stopping at the Donbass region. His troops have taken over Chernobyl. There's now accusation that some nuclear storage facility in Kiev has been nuked, not nuked, but just hit with a missile. So there's radiation leakage all over the country, and he's encircling cities. So this is kind of a situation you're faced with at the moment. But the way I see it is this, and this is a tragedy of geopolitics. I think there's been a paradigm shift in especially the US establishment, and it hasn't been for the better. And that has been, especially with the Democrats, they had this belief in an international liberal order, which is every country respects rights, and we respect the International Criminal Court and the UN and these wonderful organizations. Well, in practice, that doesn't work that way. If you go back to the logic of the 19th century, which is what Putin follows, and to an extent what most of the American establishment used to follow, which is countries have spheres of influence. So if Russia or China were to have a military alliance with Mexico tomorrow morning, you will find all the guys at the Texas borders with all their million guns, and the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and whoever you will stop whatever government the military alliance is building up there. Russia sees Ukraine as part of its spheres of influence. So how do you strike a balance between what is going on in Russia and the European security concerns? And this is where Minsk II came in. It was quite a good agreement. It was signed by Russia, by Ukraine, by the UN Security Council, and Samantha Powell wanted to endorse it from the US. So it's sort of a done deal, which essentially calls for the deneutralization of Ukraine. And there was a military arrangement as to how the security of Ukraine will be dealt with. Okay, Chris used to call it the Finlandization of Ukraine, which I think is a very good term.
Which deal is that?
That is Minsk II.
Okay.
That's Minsk II agreement. So which signed, I think it was 2015, if I'm not mistaken now. But it was
2014.
2014, yeah. So basically, there was a deal on the table. Now, this is where the story becomes criminal to me. If you have a diplomatic agreement, you don't have a legitimacy for war. Why don't we go back to the agreement that was signed? This is the view endorsed by John Mearsheimer, who is a realist in international politics, by Noam Chomsky, who is so far left, he's sitting on Stalin's side. Any part of the political spectrum is saying, look, guys, we have diplomatic agreement in place. Why are we killing each other? Why don't we just respect what we signed already? And all the US had to do is put pressure on Ukraine to respect the agreement. And Russia was sort of, France actually, I think Macron was with Putin a week ago, and he said, well, why don't we implement this thing? So France is already thinking this way. But no, we have to kill each other. And, Putin is now proposing a neutral Ukraine, which is exactly what the agreement said. So there's no reason to go and shoot a country if you have an agreement to do the same thing in the first place. So there was a writer, Anatol Lieven, who said something of the sort, it's the most dangerous conflict in the world, with potentially the easiest solution. Enforce the agreement that already exists.
I think that point is a critical one, because with those of us who have not been following this issue, we would think that this conflict is something new, it's fresh, it has no historical context. It's just, it's a now thing involving Biden, let's say, Zelenskyy and Putin, but clearly it's not. There are two reasons, number one. Number two, within the Ukraine itself, Zelenskyy doesn't have the full support that, the world media almost portrays him as to having. there are these regions, as you said, the Donbass broadly, but I think it's broken into Luhansk and Gabriel, help me.
Donetsk.
Donetsk, that are actually very pro-Russia, that see the rolling in of Russian tanks and say, yes, absolutely, we want to see more of this. Robert, I'll come to you in a moment. I want to Gabriel to unpack some things. Gabriel, there's a post I put up that I want you to chew on. There are so many moving parts to this conversation. It's so difficult to have it, really. But, even as I say this, talk to me about two discernible things. Number one, those separatist regions that I speak of. Putin effectively says, I'm moving into Ukraine because I want to support their independence. Firstly, I'm recognizing their independence and I want to support their independence, number one. Number two, he has his own internal pressures politically in Russia that is almost prompting him to do this. I want you to speak to those 2 points, please.
Okay, happily. Just as it happens, I think it's Donetsk. I can't remember if it's Lugansk or Donetsk. I think it's Donetsk that used to be called Stalina for a while.
That's Ukrainian.
After old Stalin, after the Georgian/Soviet Stalin. I mean, you got to remember the former Soviet Union countries really were Soviet Union countries. And it wasn't just the name of the city, it was also of a million population. It's also the name of the oblast, which is the province. And to think about those two provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, so there's the capital cities, but they're also the names of provinces. I think if you add the populations up, it comes to like 5 million including the provinces. And so it's a substantial number of people, maybe even 6. And it's got a lot of little towns, but it's also got a lot of Ukraine's industrial base. It's sort of part of this sort of coal basin that traditionally has been around. In a way, I sometimes think of Ukraine compared to Russia the same way I think of Zimbabwe compared to South Africa.
Lesotho is a better example, by the way.
Well, excepting in the sense that Zimbabwe was like the breadbasket, and Ukraine has 25% of Europe's black soil. It's a great agricultural center, but it's like poorer. It's less developed. Its political framework, in my opinion, is less democratic and sophisticated. So in all of these ways, it's a little bit like Zim versus South Africa. As bad as South Africa is, Zim's kind of worse off. As bad as Russia is, Ukraine's kind of worse off in a lot of ways in terms of leadership failures. But so that sort of gives a bit of a context for why people in Lugansk and Donetsk feel so dissatisfied. They belong to a country even outside of the things Hugo was mentioning, which are correct, like the language policy banning Russian from schools since 2019, initially banning it as an official language in 2014, around the time of that coup. There's that cultural stuff done in the name of decommunization. But then there's also this just very simple stuff, like Ukraine has a utility service that's kind of worse than ESCOM, and corruption that attacks, the left and the right. Trump, I'm sorry, we've lost Chris, but like Trump's campaign advisor was corruptly connected to Ukraine, as was Biden's son. So people there that are frustrated have those issues. And I'll say one last thing about just answering that question about Donetsk and Luhansk, which is that there is a phrase about the Donbass and about Donetsk in particular. And it's, what is it? Donbass nie pod... I won't say the Russian version, I'll say the translation because I can't remember the exact phrase. But it's basically, they don't send empties, which is a strange Russian way of saying, like, they don't send empty wagons of coal. It means in some parts of Russia, in some parts of the world, there are some people that are a little bit empty inside. But the people that come out of the Donbass are full of coal. They're full of fire. They're ready to burn. It's got a reputation in that whole world, Russia and Ukraine included, of being quite a rough and tumble place, quite industrially dynamic relative to this sort of quite agricultural country, but also being pretty hard. And tragically, we are seeing a lot of the most serious allegations of war crimes over the last 8 years and right now coming out of that, as well as the neo-Nazi allegations with the Azov battalion. I mean, admittedly neo-Nazi according to their own leadership, some of them. and so on. But there's like quite a hard-assed attitude there, and so it's really worrying at this time of war that the sadism can sort of break out. Okay, so Sihle, your question was firstly about those two regions. Maybe a little bit of background that's helpful. It's really hard to. There's more I'd love to say, but the second question was about Putin's domestic political pressures going into the war. I think this is where my analysis really diverges from most people's, which is that I knew that there'd be an invasion. I thought the timing would be a bit different, but I knew there'd be an invasion more or less from mid-January, when the Communist Party, which is the second largest party in Russia, said that we want to table a motion to respect the independent People's Republic, so-called, of Donetsk and Lugansk. In other words, to say these two regions in Ukraine, we as the Russian parliament are going to make a law that says Russia has to recognize their independence. And from 3 days after that proposal was made, reading the Russian language media, it was mentioned in one English publication, which is the Moscow Times, which is basically Russian but in English. But other than that, you could only really read about it in Russian. And it just struck me that none of the political parties were standing up to the plate and saying what was so obviously true, which is that it's a bad idea to recognize these independent people's republics if you want to avoid war. Because if you recognize them, you have to go to war. That's what recognizing them means. Because part of those regions, and this goes back to what Hugo was saying, the Minsk II agreements laid out the process for keeping Donetsk and Lugansk inside of Ukraine, so that Ukraine is an independent country, and these pro-Russian areas, these areas where people speak Russian, they stay inside Ukraine, and they get an arrangement, like Scotland has an arrangement in the United Kingdom, or Quebec or whatever. They get an arrangement where they have their own federal dispensation. They can choose some of their budget. They can choose how their schooling works. They can make sure that Russian doesn't get taken away from schools and business and so on. But at the same time, they belong to Ukraine. And the reason that was a good idea from Putin's point of view was, as long as they were inside Ukraine, they could stop Ukraine from joining NATO, which achieves the buffer state status that would keep peace, according to a certain theory that I happen to subscribe to. And according to Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, two of Ukraine's previous presidents, and I've got their tweets, they said exactly for this reason that Minsk II is a bad deal. They said it was a mistake getting into Minsk II because it will stop us from ever being able to join NATO. Okay, so Putin, in a way, wanted Minsk II. He wanted to implement it. He got his government to sign on it. He got his he got Lavrov to advertise why it's a really good idea. You've got Ukrainians saying it's a terrible thing. We can't do this because it'll stop us from joining NATO. Now, Parliament comes along. The Communist Party comes along and says, we have to ignore Minsk II. The Ukrainians haven't implemented the elections in 8 years. They've screwed it up. So now what we have to do is let these two regions come out of Ukraine, carve Ukraine apart. And the inevitable effect will be that the remainder of Ukraine will join NATO. They recommend this. And Sihle, from the 3 days after, when I started reading the story in proper Russian, I just couldn't find any parliamentarian saying, you guys are not seeing past your nose. The moment you recognize Lugansk and Donetsk, what you're going to cause is a split in Ukraine, and then the remainder of Ukraine is going to be 100% Ukrainian, and they're going to go and join NATO. No one was making that argument. They were just stuck in the same thing you were describing on social media, where they all had to say, no, that's a good idea, and if you want to do anything else, you're too weak. And they went through all of the talking points of all the terrible ways in which the Ukrainian government failed to live up to its own promises. They got a lot of moral stick to. They got a lot of nasty things to say about the enemy, but they didn't flip and think about their own situation. And so they passed that law on 15th February, saying you must recommending to the president that he respect Donetsk and Lugansk. And then I thought there's no ways that he can fail to go ahead and respect them, and that eventually that's going to result in a war. I thought that he would be smart enough not to invade as he has done, but instead to say, look, I've got the moral upper hand, because we all signed onto the Minsk II agreement. The Ukrainians didn't live up to their end of the bargain. They didn't allow a vote to go through. There was a very specific time period when that vote should have happened. They didn't let it happen. They didn't pass a law that they said that they would pass. And now we've passed a law saying we're going to respect these independent regions. But rather than go to war over it, I just want to say we've got all the paperwork lined up. America, come to the party. Chris was saying America hasn't come to the party. I agree, but I think in a different way. I think what America needed to do, what France could have done better, what the UK absolutely was not interested in doing, was offering a little bit of criticism to the Ukrainians and say, guys, you're not perfect. You're not angels. You're a flippin' corrupt country that's very badly administered. And you know how you can make things better? Stick to your promise and let the people in Lugansk and Donetsk have a vote. Let them have a vote and we will see how does it go. The Russians agreed that vote must be supervised by the Organization for European Security. So it's not going to be that crazy, no matter how difficult the situation is. Just let them have a vote and respect that vote and pass the law that clearly delineates what the territorial boundaries are. That's the other promise that they broke. One of the other ones they broke. Just do that, and then we will give you another $1 billion. Instead of, no, we'll just give you another $1 billion if you stop prosecuting my son or whatever it is that Biden said that he'd managed to pull off, and whatever it is Trump is being accused of. Sorry, Sihle, I see you talking. I'm going on too long, but I can't hear you.
No, I can't hear you.
You don't seem to be muted, but we can't hear you, dude.
Ooh, might be those new headphones that you've got.
Okay.
Maybe.
Hi guys, can you hear me now?
Now we hear you.
There
Yeah.
we go.
100%.
All right, I think my batteries have just died here. Robert, let me come to you because, Hugo Gabriel sets out a very broad and necessary picture that I think gives historical context and current political pressures, realities into the conversation. But there's a geopolitics here that involves two characters who we've kind of skirted talking about. Number one, the actual president of Ukraine, pardon me. Here's a chap now who's being celebrated, venerated, given an almost hero status. You half expect any picture of him to look like this. Like something, super grand, But there's something problematic about this guy for me, and Gabriel touched on it earlier on in a moment, a second ago, pardon me. The Ukraine is a really corrupt country, and Tucker Carlson framed it quite nicely for me, where he said, in real terms, it might not even be a country more than it is a client state of the US State Department. And perhaps those are the sort of things that are seeing someone like Putin worry when he then looks at, for example, that historical context that Gabriel painted of the Donbass and those two regions, whether they'll eventually finally have that vote, for example. So speak to me about what you're seeing in this regard. And even as you're framing your thoughts, just prepare. I'll come to you first with the question of Taiwan and what we might now see there, given what we're seeing in the Ukraine at the moment.
Hello. Sorry, were you asking me?
Yes, Rob.
Well, I mean, look, the thing with Ukraine is that the particular species of corruption they have is one that tangles up like all of the big elites in not only the Democratic Party in the United States, but also the Republican Party. So you've got members of the Romney family, you've got your Dan Crenshaws, you've got your Biden family, you've got the Pelosi family, you've got the Obama family. All of them have been taking little slices of basically cousins, daughters, sons, whatever, will get sort of these ghost positions in Ukrainian state-owned corporations or legal monopolies. And that's how they siphon off billions and billions of dollars that they pump into the country in aid. So they're using the Ukraine not only as a way to sort of colonially strip mine the country, but also for laundering US taxpayer money into their own pockets. So they can't actually accuse their little puppet of being corrupt, and they can't risk alienating this guy. And because they've been so buddy-buddy with him over sort of common theft, there's a degree to which they have to be a lot more friendly with Zelenskyy. And I think that they've given him reason to be far more confident than he has any right to be. And it's given him reason to think that he can try and sort of instigate conflict in the breakaway regions. And I mean, look, I don't quite agree with you, Gabriel, that it would have been problematic to recognize those things, because you look at it from Putin's perspective. He has to draw some line in the sand that says, okay, you can't infinitely expand NATO, because the open intention of NATO is regime change in Russia. And the most popular philosopher and historian in Russia at the moment is not, as most people say, Alexander Duigan, but actually this very strange little man called Dmitry Galkovsky. And Dmitry Galkovsky, you're aware of who he is. The whole thing of very big, the idea that the Soviet Union, a lot of justification for this, even though Galkovsky is very, very weird and off the wall in his interpretations. So he says that the Soviet Union was a British-American crypto colony of Russia. And the understanding is that Stalin, as nasty as he was the only one within that system to push back against the program. And this you can see in bucking against Bretton Woods, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, if you read Anthony Sutton's work, you'll see actually right away that all of the major Wall Street corporations were backing the Bolsheviks and getting enormous contracts out of them. I mean, Magnitogorsk was built by General Electric. Standard Oil got a monopoly on extracting Russian oil for a number of years. The idea that they were anti-capitalist is about as ludicrous as saying that Kwame Nkrumah was an anti-colonialist. I mean, this is a man who handed his entire economy to what's that guy's name? Tiny Rowland, who is backed by MI5. So, I mean, we've got this worldview that sort of says, well, okay, the colonialists are capitalists, and then the communists are anti-colonialists. And the reality is that it's far more complex than that. And where it comes to Russia in the modern day, you really can see this confusion. So you'll see communists, hard right reactionaries, all kinds of funny people backing Russia. And at the same time, you'll find purist white nationalists and expansionist neoliberals and State Department officials and sort of liberal progressivists all backing the Ukraine. And I think the reason for this is that at a deeper level, where all of the various models of governance and control line up, doesn't actually match any ideology for this particular conflict. This is a raw conflict of interests, of geopolitical interests. And for Russia, they have to find one way of deterring NATO advance. Because for them, NATO advance comes with the threat of, well, you know, it's the great game from the 19th century. Russia was willing to... Russia lost a Tsar in that period, Tsar Paul, over his attempt to steal India from Russia. And so this sort of conflict with the Anglo-American world goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And the last time they were sort of steady allies was in the 17th century. Sorry, the 18th century. And so the animosity is very, very deep. And I mean, Galkovsky, I mean, Putin's daughter tweets out references to him on social media. So the idea that Putin's not thinking along these lines, at least peripherally, is rather foolish. And in his speech, he talks about Ukraine being this sort of fake country and a sort of launching pad for Anglo-American aggression. And so I think sort of bearing in mind that I mean, the reason they had to take Ukraine, for example, from the Russian perspective, is, look, if the Ukraine, so the Ukraine's government was toppled in 2014 by a CIA coup. You had State Department officials showing up in person to lead, to take part in the Maidan protests. And I mean, like John McCain himself, I mean, the level of sort of blatant involvement was ludicrous. And then the thing is, if you let an American client state take control of Crimea, well, you can freeze Russia out of a hell of a lot of sea trade. And right now, the big people who America needs to leverage are Turkey, because they're the only people who can block off the Black Sea.
Yeah.
So at this point now, it's really very raw realpolitik, and everything else is propaganda.
Robert, I'm going to stick with you for a moment, and then I'll come to Hugo. And I want to stick to this guy, this president, this phenomenon that we're being sold at the moment of the Ukrainian president. For instance, one of the things that I just quickly picked up, I had a clip of it, and my apologies for not being able to show it. He then comes out and says, okay, I'm heading to the streets. I'm fighting against the Russians. Look at me, I'm a hero. Not only that, I'm asking for citizens. Come forward, get yourself an assault rifle, defend your country. Now, let me be quick little disclaimer here. I don't mind that. I'm quite pro that generally, insofar as, I believe people should be armed in any society like this, regardless of wartime or not. But it seemed a little awkward to me that on the one hand, he downplays the Russian invasion to an extent, but then also says, well, hang on, citizens come out and defend effectively the government of this country. That's where I actually disagree as a libertarian on why he was arming people, but that's neither here nor there. But talk to me about this character. We're literally being sold this guy, Robert, as some hero. For me, that comes across as a bit weird. I don't know. Maybe I'm being overly suspicious.
Well, it's part of the course. I mean, if you want to, you have to think about it before you think about it from the Western perspective. Think about it from the Ukrainian perspective. You cannot have solidarity as a military force, and this war is very serious for everyone involved. That you can't have any sort of morale if you don't respect your leader, and so everyone needs to feel confidence in their commander. And so you can understand it for the Ukrainians, at least from that perspective. From the West, they want to support that because that's their guy, that's their boy. And he has to be venerated to the ultimate degree, not just because of this whole solidarity of the Ukraine thing, but also because there's concrete political investments in the credibility of this man. There's concrete ideological commitments in terms of form of government, right to rule, right of sphere of influence. Over Ukraine, you have to believe that this is a good guy, and whatever shortcomings his government have, it's this is just sort of a hangover of the system he's inherited, and the guy's cleaning house or whatever. And it's the same thing as the regime, the sort of quasi-regime change that happened between Zuma and Ramaphosa. I mean, you can immediately see everyone has to believe that Ramaphosa is this perfect good guy who's battling against the forces of evil in the government. When it's not true. He's the most viciously corrupt parasite we've ever had. He makes he traded the Guptas for the Rothschilds and handed them control of half the finances of the state. He's literally directly handed over the finances of ESCOM to Rothschild Capital, and we're sitting here going, "Oh no, state capture, that's a thing of the past. Come on." And it's rather sort of silly. If you have, and this is largely because, if you look at the structure of South Africa, you see the same thing. All of politics is really patronage. So for your big newspapers, Daily Maverick and Mail and Guardian, they are mostly funded by either Bill Gates or by George Soros, and so their interests are entirely tied into transatlantic capital, and those people are close personal friends with the Rothschilds. Because there's a permanent set of cultural elites who've been hanging around, and it's not even like there's. And I know because of the names I mentioned, people are going to think there's a Jewish dimension, but it's not really like that. I mean, take for example like the Ford family and the Cargill family and so on. These are WASPs, It's just that there's a set of people who've been in charge, who've been in charge for a very long time in the West. And regardless of their sort of religious background, they're kind of a permanent feature, and they all know each other, and they have oligarchical influence. And you look at sort of NATO's influence in South Africa, you can see the same thing. You can see DFR labs. They put a lot of money into picking guys who will nitpick any right-wing criticism, or whether from black right-wingers or right-wingers, of their favored political patronage system in South Africa. And the same goes for Ukraine. The patronage network in Ukraine must be protected because the ruling class of America Pelosi, Biden, blah, 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 have invested their very, very shaky reputation in these people. And if you scratch under the surface for 5 seconds, they come up very rotten.
And I must be frank here, especially as someone who is a Jew on this panel. I'm very cautious of that trope. I know exactly. I know you're not employing it, but it is one that's often brought out that somehow Jews control the world. Guys, we don't.
Right. I mean, I'll give you a point. It is an exactly backwards relationship here. For example, I mean, a lot of people look at the Oppenheimers. Now, they do control a huge portion of the economy. And in the 1980s, they managed to control directly or indirectly 80% of the formal economy by trying to. But the thing is that they're not the top of the pyramid there. I mean, they have for a long time been patrons of J.P. Morgan, and so it's they look like the Jews are on top here, but they've really got sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants funding them from overseas. So it gets a little more complex than that.
In fact, speaking about complexity, guys, we're running out of time. I'm just going to ask to squeeze an extra 15 minutes, nothing more than that. So we'll end at 1:45, please, 10, just to give everybody a chance to unpack a few more issues, because we still need to whittle this towards the direction of what I consider to be the real threat to the global order of peace, really, which is China. But we'll get to that in a moment, guys, in just 1 second. Hugo, I haven't given you a chance to chime in for quite a while. There's been quite a few things said here, and I want you to, if there's anything you want to respond to, please respond. But also, I just want to read a few comments, because remember, here on Liberty and Friends, you, dear viewer, are a part of the show. So we've been flighting your comments on the screen. I've got a bit of a funny one at the moment. And I must quickly say this quick disclaimer. Guys, I have no side, I have no dog in this race. So don't please perceive me as being, he's pro-Ukraine or pro-Russia or blah, 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 blah. No. Mine is to say, let's unpack this issue, learn from it, and before you even take a side, understand what all sides are dealing with and what the metrics are, because there are a lot of moving parts to this particular story. Quick shout out to Thomas Alexander with the near €5 super chat. Shout out to you, homie. And your message is actually kind of scary. Thomas saying, hey man, I'm stuck in Chernobyl right now. Please wish me luck. BDL, homie, I do wish you luck. I'm hoping you're able to get out there if that is your intention, to get out. But that's also part of the story, Hugo, here that maybe we've missed. This is a war. There are people behind these numbers that we're often hearing who are suffering, both local Ukrainians, of course, and various people who, for whatever reason, they found themselves in Ukraine or maybe struggling to get out. Hugo?
Yeah, I mean, look, the people in Donbass in particular have suffered a lot for the last 8 years. So I understand completely the resentment and stuff. And as I say, if after propaganda stuff, I don't know if it's propaganda or whatever I've seen, because it's difficult, to flood it with information at this stage is true, then it's obviously concerning. We've seen photos of people trying to leave Ukraine for Poland. That doesn't surprise me at all. We know in Donbass itself, the population used to be around 5 million. It's now down to 1.5 or something. So 4 million people have been displaced.
Wow.
So that is something like the same amount of people in Syria, unless I'm missing in the calculations, right? So it's not a small feat. Usually they become internal migrants to Ukraine, I would suspect, or they go to Russia. But either way, these are people whose lives have been disrupted because of some great political power play. Just to address your point on Zelenskyy, look, there's a cult of personality being formed around them, and they're trying to sell it to us. I don't buy anything of it. He is, it's a stranger situation. I mean, there's no logic internally or externally. First of all, the CIA instigated a coup d'etat. They also trained the Azov Battalion, which is a neo-Nazi group, and yet the president is Jewish. Okay, so I can't explain it, and I'm sure there's no logic there. It's just about power and control. Also, some of the neo-Nazis who supported Donald Trump were inspired by the narratives being sold in Ukraine. Okay, but then you find the far right in America. Some of them support Putin. So, I can't follow any logic in what is going on in the ground. This is just pure power. This is just about shooting a country. What does concern me is the money for weapons. Ukraine has become a dumping ground for basically the war on terror. There's no more war in Afghanistan. All that weapons have moved to Ukraine. And the money I'm seeing, it's something like 450 million a year, a few billion a year, just of bullets. There's more bullets than people at the moment. Okay, it's an utterly absurd situation. What are you going to do with all those guns? I don't know. Look, I'm very neutral on having your own gun. I don't have a very strong view on that, but it's absurd to have that amount of military weapons. There's accusations that the USA moved biosecurity labs there, biological warfare labs. Now, I haven't confirmed that, but that's been doing its round on social media as well. So, all these things have to be checked out. But to make a country a dumping ground for weapons and to think that's going to bring stability to the region is utterly absurd. Right. So there has to be a reflection in policy. And I would say go back to the Minsk agreement, try and find a way to neutralize Ukraine and bring it back to the Finland model. It does concern me that Germany is thinking of rearmament. I don't think Germany and Russia having soldiers at each other is a good thing. Historically, it didn't work out very well. The same thing is Finland and Sweden are talking about joining NATO. They didn't even do that during the Cold War. We don't need that in Europe, right? Those countries have been non-aligned, they've been neutral. Austria as well played a very good role in the Cold War, where it was sort of a bridge between East and West. And that's kind of the role you want Ukraine to play. Okay, Ukrainians speak Russian. Half of them speak Russian. They can also negotiate between the Poles, who historically had grievances with the Russians. So there's a very good role with them if they can look at what the Belgians and Luxembourgers do. I mean, whenever we do a deal here in France and we do a deal with the Germans, you always find a guy from Belgium or Luxembourg. He's the guy to talk with the Germans. Because the same with the Dutch. The Dutch don't have a military, but they're rich because they trade themselves between all these partners. The Swiss as well. The Swiss play Monopoly when everyone's playing war. So Ukraine has to find something like that, but they cannot become a stash for weapons and to think that is going to solve the problem of Russia. Russia sees it's a threat. Whether we like it or not is kind of irrelevant to me. Right? Russia saw Georgia as a threat, tiny little Georgia. It made Putin panic, and they invaded South Ossetia. That was wrong to invade them. There was massive crimes, but that's what's going to happen. Ukraine is a bigger baby to deal with, but it's not the size of Russia. And, there's an Afrikaans saying, like, as jy vir kak soek, gaan jy kak kry. I don't know how to translate it well to English.
No, we understood you only.
But that is kind of what is happening over here. We were looking for trouble with Putin. Okay, he's been giving warnings. Now, he can be a tyrant and a dictator, but, if somebody's has warned you 10 times that he's going to beat you and you still try and poke him on the nose, don't be surprised he's going to slap you, right? And this is what Putin just did. He overreacted. The Senate snapped. I don't think even Russian analysts expected an invasion. I saw no sensible analysts who expected invasion. Yet it happened. And remember, the First World War broke out. People thought that when Franz Ferdinand got killed, it's going to be a local war limited to the Balkans. And before you knew it, entire Europe was killing each other. We don't need that. We want to try and avoid that. So I would like, in the French election coming up, that France does not get involved militarily. But I don't know if we're going to be drawn into it. I don't know if Germany is going to rearm, and before you know it, you've got the war machine going again. All of this is stupid. We can dissolve the issues and find diplomatic solutions. They're not easy. It's going to need reconciliation. You're going to need a Desmond Tutu of sorts to come and talk to the guys. Whatever you need, right? But that is the type of thinking you need to solve the problem at the moment.
Guys, give me a second, please, just to quickly do some housekeeping. Welcome to it. We're in the final, effectively 30 minutes of the show. If you've just joined us, this is Liberty and Friends. I'm in conversation with Rob Duigan. He's now with Afriforum, does great research for them. Some interesting stuff that's going to come out of that part of the world. We'll probably discuss it in another show. Hugo Kruger, writer, analyst, and commentator, really, someone who is right now coming to us from France. So he has skin in the game, trust me, when it comes to the potential of any massive European conflict in that part of the world. Of course, I'm not wishing that. And of course, Gabriel Crouse, Institute of Race Relations, head of campaigns in that part of the world, also the host of Two Crickets in a Thorn Tree. Welcome to it. Please, guys, get my likes up. We have a massive audience tonight, but the engagement is nowhere near where it should be. If you're liking this conversation, please hit that like button. Hey, if you don't like it, hey, hit that down thumb sign too. Just get my engagement, please, up over 50%. This is Liberty and Friends. Hugo, I'm going to stick with you for a moment, and then I'll come to Gabriel, because I think we must segue this conversation to looking at what's happening. If you have a massive nuclear power like this one, almost with impunity and with no sense of fear, if you will, of the US, that's the United States of America under a one Joe Biden. If you then have a nuclear power like this one saying, you know what, stuff it. I have some interest in the Ukraine. Whether you agree with that position or not is irrelevant. That's not what I'm prosecuting here. But the fact that they've decided to do this, engage in effectively a war in this time and age, even with the fear of the US or the lack thereof of the fear of the US, it begs the question, what will China do? Winnie the Pooh, Xi Jinping right now is looking at Taiwan and going, goody, goody, I see a pot of honey. Maybe I should head over in that part of the world and see what's going on. Will the US stand up there where they have not stood up here in the Ukraine? Your thoughts, Hugo?
Well, I think Southeast Asia is different because it's one of the few places in the world where US military presence is actually welcomed. So they have a military there. There's no antagonism as in Europe, where the Europeans are in between. The Japanese want the US to be there. And, China, I'm still divided if it isn't just another boogeyman of the 21st century. And I really mean that. I get that Chinese military is growing, but when I look at articles in the gray zone about the claims being made against Uyghur genocide and the audits being done, a lot of it has to do with far-right Ukrainian nationalists of all causes trumping up the Uyghur story. There's a lot of overblown exaggeration there as well. Now, I don't know what to make because my brother was in China and he went to Urumqi and he also almost ended up being in jail for looking at those quote-unquote prison camps. And some people say they're concentration camps. Some people say they're labor camps, like Xi Jinping say they're education camps, But there are claims being made of genocide, and there's people that are skeptical against the story. Now, I'm very careful to deny genocide because that's usually the first thing that people do. But I also try and think, isn't this just another story that's being sold to us? China internally has a lot of issues, right? China has separatist movements in Uyghurs. They have Inner Mongolian problems. They have problems with Tibet. Will China be able to squeeze people out of the South China Sea? That's kind of where they are, squeezed by the US Navy. I very much doubt it. And so I get the impression that there's also a bit of an overplay of Chinese. But if I have to choose, I would say China's a bigger threat than Russia, for sure. So, if we want to take on China, potentially, I would say it'd be a good thing to try and stroke Putin's ego a little bit and say to him, look, we'd rather have a Russian autocrat than a Chinese autocrat at this stage,
Sure. Gabriel, China's the bigger threat than Russia at the moment? Your agreement?
I've got 2 points on that. The one is that if Hugo had been the head of the German Navy and said what he just said, he would have been fired. And I'm not speculating. German Vice Admiral K. Achim Schönbach said in, I think it was late January, in a security conference in India, that Putin's fundamental interests in protecting his borders by trying to maintain buffer states must be respected, and that it'd be better to have Russia together with sort of NATO countries containing Beijing's China than have Russia with Beijing's China sort of pushing back against those NATO countries. And he was forced he was forced into resignation by Olaf Scholz's the new German Chancellor within 24 hours. So Hugo, you can be very lucky that you're not being employed by the German government, because they would have fired you immediately for suggesting that it'd be better. Now, why? My second point is that, Sihle, you and I on the Big Daddy Liberty Show have spoken a few times about the strange fact that the Russian parliament, the Duma, has voted to recognize the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. And thereafter, when Putin said, okay, I will do it, and there will be implications, ratified that in a further vote at the lower chamber of the Duma and the upper chamber. It is a very unusual thing for two democracies to go to war with one another. In fact, so unusual that it's sort of a debating point that it never happens, and this is why you should be a democracy. This is a way to sort of beat those who are in favor.
Two examples. One is South Africa. Don't forget.
So there are counterexamples, but where you find those counterexamples, there are generally sort of profound reasons for saying they're not actually democracies. And in Ukraine's case, I can see why you would say Ukraine is not a democracy, because it had a coup in 2014 that's never been properly acknowledged. And ever since then, no one in Crimea nor in the Donbass has been allowed to vote in a Ukrainian election, even though, according to the Ukrainian government in Kiev, those are both parts of Ukraine. So, like, there's a logical inconsistency. If you say you were part of Ukraine, then you should let us vote. And if you want to say, okay, the Crimean removal to Russia is legal, then you should recognize it. But you can't have your cake and eat it too. That's technical. I'm not saying it justifies Putin's actions of attacking Kiev or Kharkiv. I don't think it does myself. But I'm just saying I can see why you would say Ukraine is not a democracy, because it had a coup that goes unacknowledged. To say that Russia is not a democracy is also possible, but then you must say South Africa is not a democracy, because Russia is not a democracy in the political science sense that a robust democracy is one in which you've had multiple changes of power peacefully through the ballot of different parties and different leaders. South Africa has not had that, right? We are not a robust democracy according to the strict pol sci definition, because it's always been the ANC since our new constitution. Likewise, Russia is not a democracy because Putin's been in charge for a year and a day. United Russia has been in charge basically since Yeltsin. Okay, since after Gorbachev, you've had one body really ruling the show. I think it would be crazy to say that. Also, by the way, there's election fraud in South Africa, not as much as in Russia, but Russian election fraud, I can't think of any serious person who thinks that if elections were perfectly free and fair, the result would be anything other than Putin winning, right? And why is it? It's because you've got institutions like Levada, which is more or less the Institute of Race Relations of Russia, credible think tank that commissions independent polling, finding that Putin's popularity is more or less the same as Cyril Ramaphosa's. He's got 60% numbers, poll approval numbers. It's like 30 points higher than Joe Biden. He's a very popular leader. For better or worse, Russians vote for Putin, and they vote for, in their parliamentary election, they voted for a parliament which ended up voting for this war. I'm very depressed when I look at Russian parliamentary politics, because United Russia's got problems. The Communist Party is the second biggest party. It's run by a dude. Some people think, oh, the communists launched the bill, they must be Putin's puppets. Yes, they should look at the head of the Communist Party, and also how he tore into Putin for being too friendly with George Bush. And after the Communist Party, you've got an even more mad irredentist party. And the fourth biggest party is an even more kind of race nationalist, mad Slavic kind of Ukrainian-style party. Russian parliamentary politics is very difficult to look at from the outside, in the same way that South African parliamentary politics is flippant depressing to look at from when I was living in America. You see, the rise of the EFF, the ANC does well, even though its leaders are clearly eating the money. You see, every time a splinter group comes out of the ANC, it sort of rises and it falls and it doesn't really achieve anything. Parliamentary politics is depressing. My point is simply this. It's a completely different ball game to China. When you have a parliament, you have a universe of problems that are very irritating. And Robert was talking about sort of big media houses that are all too forgiving on the powers that be. Yes, I feel those problems in South Africa. I see those problems in America, and I see them even worse in Russia. But you've got a parliament and you've got independent media houses. In China, you have a different universe. There is only one party you can vote for, right? There's only one system to belong to. There is only one supreme leader. There is no way to ventilate political differences peacefully. There is no prospect of changing leadership peacefully. That's literally not on the books. That is a dictatorship. That is an autocracy. And people who describe Russia as a dictator and an autocracy, Boris Johnson, who says this was not done in Russia's name. Dude, the depressing fact is this was done in Russia's name. I don't think this invasion is a good invasion. I think it's very bad to go and attack a European capital unprovoked in the strict sense. But whatever it is, like, Parliament has backed it more than any Congress backed any invasion of Iraq or anything else. It's like it's a super democratic thing in a way. And that's hard for us to think about. It's the same thing in the South African sense. It's hard for me to think about most of our parliamentarians voted for expropriation without compensation by changing the constitution. It's clearly stupid. It's clearly against people's interests, but that's what parliament did. It's not a dictatorship. Most people in parliament are going to vote for the
It's like Turkey and
expropriation.
Iran, basically. I mean, I know Iran quite well because my wife's from there. But Iran is a democracy, under quotes. It's got this great grand theocratic leader, but they do have elections and they do change hands every now and then, even though it's questionable how open they are. And Russia's sort of in that camp. It's like Erdogan. He is democratically elected, but
what it does, and here's okay, and I'll finish my point by saying this. What that does, which I think is very difficult when you think about this geopolitical question of would it be better to side with Russia against China or side with China against Russia, is you've got to think about what are the reasons that you are drawing alliances. Now, one is just pure power. So you choose whatever alliance partner at whatever time you think is going to best serve your narrow power interest. There's no morality to it. It's just that we want to knock the next guys down. And that theory, as good as it is, I feel a tension between Hugo and Robert. I think realpolitik can actually, in theory, produce very salubrious outcomes. The problem is that it creates a system in which, insofar as you tolerate it, plutocrats, people that are in charge, can use their governments as ways of satisfying their personal wealth. In other words, they can drive wars that end up satisfying themselves. If you've just got a realpolitik, no moral framework, dudes in charge can rule it. The alternative that strikes one as attractive is that you do promulgate alliances on the basis of values. And this is how America talks. They want to be allies with democracies that are constitutional and support free markets and open to trade and all that kind of stuff. The problem with that theory is not that it's a bad theory, in my opinion. In my opinion, it's a good theory. In my opinion, it means that you consider China to be a very serious threat because it's a clear autocracy and it's the second biggest superpower in the world. Those two facts combined. The problem with that theory is that you have to be very careful of honestly evaluating the credibility and legitimacy of your allies. And if it turns out that they are incredible, illegitimate, then you need to change your attitude towards them accordingly. And that's what I see not happening with Ukraine. And if this all sounds waffling, at a concrete level, if they had just criticized the Ukrainian government for not sticking to Minsk 2, then I think we would have averted this war. So that's where the rubber hits the road for me. Like, I think if you act according to your values, if you're going to be American and say, let's spread values and democracy and liberal capitalism, whatever, if you stick to it, I think it works. The problem is if you're a hypocrite, because then you just get the same plutocratic problem.
Then you have to add Saudi Arabia to the list. You have to add the slaughter of East Timor, Sumatra. Foreign policy, unfortunately, is Reagan's view, must be based on realism. My view is if a country's interest is in your geopolitical interest to intervene, do it. I mean, 1997, we forget. Lesotho said they want to take control over their water sources. Nelson Mandela, of all people, sent in the army to Lesotho. Why? Because we have an arrangement with Lesotho on water saying this is Andre Bolfre's policy, basically, of deterrent. If Lesotho turns off the tap, we turn off the electricity. Sorry, guys, you're not going to do it, or we send in the army. That's how it works in foreign policy, okay? And Mandela understood that.
Give me a second here. Give me a second just to explain to the audience what's happening. We're in the final 15 minutes of Liberty and Friends. I've just basically sent a message to all three of my participants that it's open mic. If there's any disagreements, go straight into it. You don't expect me, don't wait for me to invite you guys to say something, but just obviously give each other space to speak, please, so it doesn't become guys speaking over each other. Robert, I want to throw it to you only because you haven't had a chance to chime in here. Taiwan, they would be looking at Ukraine right now and thinking, holy heck, the Americans have literally, to an extent, taken I won't say hands off, but like not being as active as maybe they thought they would be in the situation. And it's just been peace prayers and Stinger missiles, basically from a distance. Do they have the same worry? And really, if conflict were to arise, can the Taiwanese, with the support, or actually, give me both scenarios, with and without the support of the West, can they hold their own against China? Or am I being hopefully, disillusioned? Yeah.
Well, I honestly don't know. I mean, the thing is, there are so many factors at play. I mean, I'm looking at, Japan wants America to host their nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. You've got the Japanese, because they take the Chinese so seriously, have been flip-flopping on their policy with Russia. So that, 3 or 4 years ago, they were doing joint military exercise with Russia, and today they're cancelling their SWIFT payment. They're joining the whole sort of SWIFT embargo. For anyone who isn't clued in on what SWIFT is basically this electronic protocol for transferring funds internationally between various different banks. So now the result is that Russia is now looking to build an alternative. Now, SWIFT does everything. It's every country in the world that has SWIFT. And what Russia's been doing is developing their own one. And Iran has had to find a way around it. And so they had a special joint thing with Russia that they developed, and now Russia's developing, and China now, as a result from Russia preparing for this war, they got China to agree to open up for Russian imports of grain and all kinds of stuff like that, so they can sustain their economy by opening up into the other half of the global trade system that is China. And they've also opened up they've opened up a backdoor with India, who actually has a joint governance program with Russia, where literally the members of the cabinets of both governments sit and coordinate policy on in every single area in their state. So
Russia is also building India's nuclear power stations. France lost the deal, right?
But so the parallel with Taiwan that I think is worth bearing in mind is not so much just that now you're seeing two different wings of the same sort of geostrategic economic bloc opening up, but more that the Americans have taken the same approach to them. Now, I mean, I'm with you, Gabriel, in terms of comparative threats. I mean, I actually wrote something for a NATO publication a couple of years ago, where I argued, you guys are buggering around with Russia when China's the big threat. China openly, for years now, has said that their entire program is not just global conquest, but also the complete elimination of all Western values in every single in every single instantiation and aspect. So, you look at Document 9 and this famous sort of declaration on ideology they've made in terms of what they consider the big threat. They don't like the Eurasian idea of rule of law. They don't like any sort of freedom of economy. They don't like freedom of speech. And here's the most interesting one, is what they call historical nihilism. You're not allowed to have an alternative explanation of history. But I want to put up a real paradox here, because we sit here and we talk about, do we have democracy? And China's this radically different system, and it absolutely is, for a number of reasons that that one can go into and are very challengeable. However, the West has become more and more draconian, and it has become more and more anti. But now here's the thing: I don't.
This is exactly my point. This is exactly my point: is that we look into this conflict and we're looking into the mirror.
But then we are making a deal with Vietnam with the same system as China.
Right.
I mean,
Russia is definitely serious. Russia and China are definitely seriously different from the West, in that the West, the way that the Chinese view their sort of universal imperial ambitions is as the Chinese as the master race, and the rest of the world as subordinates. The Western vision is to destroy all races, all nations, all culture, all history, and put them under permanent technocratic rule, where humans are treated universally as cattle and fed into a meat grinder to reduce the global population. So
I don't know that I agree.
That's a very extreme version of liberalism.
Yeah, of course it's extreme, but there's no way
guys, Gabriel.
across.
So I think so. Since you mentioned race, my analysis, racially speaking, of the Ukraine-Russian debacle is as follows: that what's happened in Ukraine is that you have quite a race nationalist political energy. So Hugo's talked about the Azov battalion. There are other neo-Nazi connections, but that is confused by Zelenskyy being a Jew, but it's also unconfused by a sort of richer understanding of things, but I don't want to get into that. Here's what I think is fairly straightforward. A sense that Ukrainians are a different race from Russians, that they've got a different bloodline, a different ancestry, a different history. And this is meted out in the indigenous Ukrainian bloodline law of 2018. It's meted out in language, and language and race often do end up getting inflected or conflated with each other, of both 2014 and 2019. And Putin's pushback is to say, well, here's my understanding of race. There's Rus, which is the old race, and there's Velika Rus, which is Russian, and Malorus, which is Ukrainian, and Belarus, which is Belarusian. And these three Rus families should be different countries, but they should all be friendly countries. You could go back a step further in history and talk about Slav nationalism, Gavrilo Princip, shooting Archduke Franz Ferdinand, mentioned earlier, starting
that
World War I.
just sounds
that
like glorified BS again. And it's just an excuse.
I'm not.
It's just another excuse. That's just
excuse.
excuse.
I would
These
agree
are the
with Hugo
stories.
over here.
These hold on. I'm not saying. What I'm saying is these are stories that Ukrainian leaders and Russian leaders are telling to their populations in order to try and explain themselves.
But this is micro
They are
narratives.
stories that people, to
these are
some
not the grand
extent,
power narratives of the Atlantic world. The power narratives.
Let me try and stitch it back in, and I'll just be one more moment.
Right.
When I look at the way that the left-right politics connects in America to what I see happening in Ukraine, I do notice that while both the Republican and the Democratic Party were actually strict on Russia and trying to keep them at bay and supplied a lot of arms to Ukraine and try to give them a good effort at independence, the difference was in narrative. And when Trump was in charge, the narrative with Ukraine was very different. With Biden in charge, it feels much more to me, and tell me that I'm wrong, that the Democrats' play of trying to pick victim races and saying, once you've got a victim race, the best thing you can do is excuse all of their wrongdoings. Their enemy is white monopoly capital. It's terrible. It's evil. It can only be wrong. The same way that silly Democrats think about black and white Americans, they think about Ukrainians and Russians. And I'm not saying that that's overly determined how NATO has played out. I think when you confront a guy like Hugo who's thinking about European politics, it's a different story. But yes, the old-fashioned idea of like our race is the victim race, therefore we can do whatever we want to do. I see some Democrats projecting that onto Ukrainians. I see that as being a very important reason that they wouldn't pressure Ukrainians into making the concessions that needed to be made. And I think for Ukraine to become a buffer state rather than half of it to become a Russian state and half of it to become a NATO state, so that you've got nuclear missiles sitting 5 kilometers from each other pointed in opposite directions, which strikes me as the worst case scenario. You need concessions. And I don't think America is going to go for concessions, in part because they think of the Ukrainians as being a victim race.
Guys, can I quickly throw in here, Rob? Sorry, I'll come to you first, Rob, because I just want to honor my viewers, please. The issue of South Africa in this, it's a bit of a petty point, but I had to get it out because people want to ask the question. South Africa's been making a whole bunch of noise around this. In fact, there's once again, South African government speaking with a forked tongue. The Department of International Relations and Cooperation saying, oh yes, we're calling, they said emphatically, for the withdrawal of Russian troops from this particular conflict. And then we read in the Sunday Times today that actually that particular statement pissed off, or it irked the president of this country, Cyril Ramaphosa, who basically said effectively, hey man, maybe we shouldn't have said that. Rather, let's focus on this notion of mediation. Can we please just chew on this for a second, please? Yeah. And just a reminder to everybody, we're kind of running out of time unless you guys want another 15 minutes, but I have to call it at that point.
I will say South Africa doesn't matter, very simply. We are not as big as we think we are.
We all agree.
But I will say this. Look, I think something went wrong. Okay, a lot of things went wrong in the education system. We stopped being educated a long time ago, but we forgot about this amazing thing called geography, which means, we have 2 oceans between us. So, despite all the posturing South Africa has about BRICS, we are still geopolitically dependent on the former British, on the Anglosphere. If the US or the UK coughs, or Germany for that matter is quite influential as well, we say how high and how high do we need to jump? despite our posturing to China and to Russia. And we're seeing this time and time again. By the way, I think it was Naledi Pandor who said she wants to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. My wife said to me, "Oh, you're like the Iranian government who thinks you can export your revolution everywhere." You know, that's pretty much like we're trying very hard, but we are
Exporting
not.
the TRC.
Yeah, exporting the TLC. Like, sorry, like I'm sure it's a nice notion, but we don't matter, and that's good.
Yeah.
South Africa is the safest place for me to go if there's really crap in Europe. So it's good not to matter sometimes.
Rob?
Yeah, the one thing that I wanted to point out, the real parallel is actually when I say how NATO is looking at those two little zones, Taiwan and Ukraine, is for a couple of years now. All of the sort of like the Atlantic Council, the Trilateral Commission, all of these people, all of their little publications, one big thing that they're pushing is we want them to invade and we want them to get stuck. We want this to be their Afghanistan. And I think, well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to inflict the maximum pain that they can possibly do on everyone involved in those regions in order to bleed dry their geopolitical enemies. So what they've done is they've deliberately instigated a war in Ukraine. They've deliberately encouraged Zelenskyy to take the most maximally stupid policies possible, with guarantees that he's going to be backed up to the hilt, and then leave him to go and fight the war on his own and watch his people bleed to death for 2 decades. This is the idea. So America in this thing is actually the most maximally evil player in this whole equation. Their idea is, how can we make people suffer as long as we possibly can? Because the idea is that
It's
there cannot be an
imperialism, Bob.
exception.
That's all it is.
No, but yeah, exactly. There cannot be an exception to the global system, because the philosophy behind it is one that requires total population control. And I'm not saying this shit for because of some kind of sensationalist conspiracy theory that woke up yesterday. I mean, these have been the goals of the transatlantic community since the end of the Second World War. In fact, going back beforehand, if you look at, what's that bugger's name? Something, it's not Lindenberger, it's Leinberger. So you can look at like these old sort of OSS CIA fellows who were sort of party to the policy design that ended up creating the post-war order. You can look at the early days of UNESCO and the deliberate sort of the artificial religion program that UNESCO has was seen as its primary purpose since Julian Huxley put it together. The thing is, these organs that form the basis of the post-war international order have an extraordinarily grandiose plan for humanity that they don't manage to implement very well most of the time. But to the extent that they get what they want, it's a truly evil system. And the one place that you can see it operated fully now is in the only place that they managed to get the Great Reset sort of fully operational on schedule is Canada. So Canada is the only place where they've had like truly placed a huge number of people who really believe in this program that's been consensus position for the Atlantic Order for decades. And this is why I talk about a community. It's not just like, okay, bankers and, a few like oligarchical figures. It's like, it's everyone who's got deep positions in these old institutions has the same outlook, that what we can control the entire economic and ecosystem environment for the whole planet and micromanage everything forever.
Yeah, but it's
one thing
to create ambition.
To say that it's not everyone in those institutions. For example, a really nice book, people who are interested in this topic can check out, that won the Financial Times like Book of the Year award or whatever it was last year. It's called One More Inch. It's written by Professor how do you say her name? Satore Sarote. She's at the Johns Hopkins Institute. And One More Inch is the famous promise of the U.S. Secretary of State, I think it was at the time, James Baker, who says to Gorbachev in 1991 or around the time that Germany is looking to be reunified. Sarat, yes, we will promise you, if you let Germany reunify and you as the Soviet Russians pull out of that East Berlin thing and East Germany thing, NATO will not move one more inch to the east. And then, as Sarah says, the policy changed quite quickly to, in fact, there's not 1 inch that NATO won't try and expand into. And so I think this is what Robert's saying. Like an example of what Robert's saying of like this deep, profound interest in spreading the same rules and the same
our values
everywhere. My pushback is just to say this: what Sarah does in that book, and I've only read her synopsis and listened to her give a sort of hour-long talk on it that you can find at the Hoover Institute, is refer to many members of the Pentagon, of American intelligence, secretaries of state or deputy secretaries of state, who had a different point of view, who had a greater respect for a kind of slightly more multilateral world order. So I do think that I think even in those old institutions,
but they share the same concept of progress. And look, my perspective is not that there's perfect. It's not that there's like this perfect hive mind. Is that everyone shares the same basic moral axioms, and everyone has the same concept of where progress lies. Some people are more pragmatic, some people are more idealistic, some people are more ambitious, but they all understand that they occupy the same frame. And so you don't need to have a total conspiracy, because if everyone within the areas where you can make any actual decisions shares the same values, then the direction in which all of the institutions evolve is predetermined. And
so, Robert, let me understand you properly here, just for the sake of the audience. It's not to say that there is a conspiracy, if you will, in the sense of people meeting in a dark room and deciding on the particular fate, or maybe there is.
Yeah, well, that happens occasionally.
But what it really is, perhaps if I'm hearing you correctly, is that certain people with a certain view on the world gravitate towards being in positions of power, that is holding positions in actual institutions of society, of government and the like, and from there push that agenda using each individual institutions, but the cumulative sum of which makes it look like things are moving in a particular direction. Is that a correct assessment of what you're saying?
Sort of. But what I want to say is that I want people to actually perceive a chicken and egg problem here. It's not that there's some sort of ultimate cause you can point back to, because the ruling class does set the rules, right? And so that decides which kind of ideas are going to be permissible, which kind of ideas will look more prestigious. And look, if you go to a fancy university anywhere in the world, you understand exactly which ideas feel more professional, feel more sane, feel more sort of acceptable and erudite. And those are not necessarily more accurate or more morally good or anything like that. It's just that those signal the most prestigious ideas. And that particular framework and that ideology has been determined by UNESCO for at least 60 years. The American Social Science Research Council and UNESCO decided on what their official ideology was going to be for all social science research decades ago. They decided in 1971.
You're giving them too much credit.
No, I'm not. I'm saying look, Perrin Salsa is a very, very mainstream, very middle of the road, very milquetoast, ideologically sort of individual. But he's a very, very detailed historian. And when he talks about the evolution of these institutions, he says, well, that little conference, and these are very small organizations, the social science research bodies, okay? And they just happen to be very prestigious. And so when they decided that they were going to have an official ideology for picking apart nationalist orders in order to preserve international cooperation and get rid of dangers to the international peace, they decided on certain ideas. And key amongst them was critical theory. And as a result of that, those ideas became the most prestigious ideas in academia. And as time has gone on, they've become more and more entrenched. And with time,
I don't
those
even know
ideas.
What's meant by critical theory, because some of it, just to be critical, makes sense. Then you get some.
No. You know, look, critical theory is a very specific body of work that was invented by what's now called the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, okay, I know the Frankfurt School stuff. Okay,
and
but I'm actually not opposed to all of it. So,
some of it's good.
I'm not opposed to all of it. I just think this is an emergent phenomenon in society, and it is the way it is. But getting back to Ukraine and Russia, which I think the point is, I can quote part of this if you want to go into Bilderberg and the Trilateral Commission and Council on Foreign Relations, which set most of the US foreign policy, which is true. Brzezinski was working for them, and he wrote that book on the Grand Chessboard. And part of the Grand Chessboard's theory was that Ukraine will be part of NATO in 2004. Now, sometimes these are think tank wish lists, okay, but they will be constrained by reality. And we've seen a lot of that as well. By the way, it has to be said, Zelenskyy was Polish, and the Poles had a historical antagonism against the Russians, and I think that kind of
Donald
influenced
Tusk. Can we just
Yep.
add while we mention?
Yeah,
Donald
but that
Tusk.
influenced
Well,
US foreign policy against Russia
Okay,
as well.
guys,
So, yeah.
guys, give me a second. Hugo, I must stick with you because the question kind of lends itself to it. And early in this broadcast, you mentioned you wanted to touch on it, the notion of the nuclear component to this. I think you had a different angle. I think Chernobyl, you were thinking Chernobyl
Well,
or
I
something
can
along
say
those
this
lines.
on nuclear
Touch
weapons.
on these two, please.
Yeah, on nuclear weapons, Ukraine and South Africa are the only two countries that have given up their nuclear weapons. Ukraine not voluntarily, South Africa voluntarily, and it's, I think, idiotic for us to have done so, but that's the way it is. In terms of Ukraine, the big problem is they have other nuclear reactors. So Chernobyl, I worked with one guy that designed the dome at Chernobyl. What he told me is it can survive a TNT explosion in a missile. His theory will be tested now. Okay, so hopefully it's designed for that thing. In terms of the big problem, though, is the Russians just hit a missile at the nuclear waste storage near Kiev. So we need to check that thing. The thing is, nuclear waste, people misunderstand that. Just because there's nuclear waste doesn't mean it's death. But the big problem is they've got other reactors operating in Ukraine that's supplying nuclear energy to Ukraine. And if any of those get hit, you might have an actual Chernobyl, because Chernobyl is not an issue anymore because it's already burned through. The big issue will be, what if the cooling water goes away from all the other reactors? Then you have groot kak on your hands. So I don't know. So yeah, hopefully the Russians don't attack it. Generally, it's against the Geneva Convention to attack these things in war. And unlike the US, the Russians actually signed that part of the Geneva Convention.
And Russia
Guys,
has to run the
we
place
have
afterwards,
run
so they can't hurt
out.
too many people.
Well, accepting. Let me just say. In terms
I'll give
of the
everybody
scenario,
one more comment.
Okay.
I promise you, Gabriel, I'll come to you next. I just wanted to quickly say we've run out of time, but as always on the show, I give everybody that final comment, and of course, them letting us know how we can reach them. Gabriel, you are up first. Final comment. How can the people reach you?
Okay. Think about scenarios coming. I think the worst scenario is something like shock and awe, Russia takes over, and now it tries to bunker down and hold all of Ukraine for a long time. The most important news story that wasn't mentioned today, breaking out of Interfax at about 4 o'clock this afternoon, and then covered in Western media, was that Ukraine and Russia both agreed to have a meeting over the river close to Gormal, close to the border. If they have a meeting and they achieve peace talks sooner rather than later, we can avoid that scenario. That scenario, I want to say, I think is good for a lot of foreign actors. I think it's good for a lot of elephants, to use the old African phrase. I think it's really rubbish for the grass. I really don't want that scenario. I hope that Putin is wise enough to avoid that scenario. I hope that Zelenskyy is wise enough to avoid that scenario, and that they find compromise. Compromise is going to happen. People are not going to get everything that they want. That's what I hope for. And if you want to see more of what we have to say about it, Nicolas Lorimer started with the show and then got taken off.
Faded on us. Shame his internet went out.
Terrible spy in the system, because Nicolas would have given the pro-NATO argument to devastate everyone. Please come and listen to Two Crickets in the Thorn Tree. He's a really smart guy. I respect that guy to the hilt. He always tells it. He always says what's true, and his analysis, where we disagree, I often find myself having nightmares, because then I wonder whether he was right. So I'd recommend that you check us out there. Thank you.
Awesome. That, of course, is Gabriel Crouse from Two Crickets in the Thorn Tree. Make sure you find their podcast on the Daily Friend website. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za. Bra Rob, let me come to you, my brother. Your final comment generally, and how do the folks find you and your writing and your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know I say a lot of hairy things, but there's usually a sort of tamer, more sane-sounding version of it if I've got time to lay it out. So, and usually that's on my blog. So my blog is on Substack. It's you can look me up on Twitter, and then the link will be in the username. And yeah, that's mainly it. I mean, look, my research for Afriforum is much more boring than my sort of political commentary, because it'll be like, technical research with all of these forests of academic footnotes. But yeah.
That, of course, is Upra Rob Duigan. Good to have him back on the show. You'll definitely see more of him here on Liberty and Friends. Hugo, last but not least, how do the folks find you? And, of course, your final comment.
They can find me on Substack. I've got an article there. I have also an Odyssey podcast where I do things. 3 of my videos have now been blocked from YouTube for asking controversial questions. So it's all on the coffee flu thing. Did a lot on that. Then also I am writing a article, working on it with I write a lot with Joel Kotkin, who's the American, and we are going to do a lot on energy policy and how net zero has geopolitical implications, which I think people have not even begin to appreciate. The Germans just felt a little bit of that, but good luck trying Putin to listen to Greta Thunberg. I don't know how you're going to decarbonize Russia. So the argument we make is listen to a guy like Stephen Koonin, who was Obama's energy advisor, who said, don't go for climate mitigation, go to climate adaptation. So in other words, if you believe in the global warming stuff, I'm skeptical, but there's different opinion. If you believe in that, prepare for a warmer climate. It's more proportionate because global warming, if it's true, benefits Russia and Canada. The North Sea Passage will open. Okay, so they're going to love pumping gas into the atmosphere, for example.
That, of course, Gabriel, you're muted. Hang on.
You're angry and muted, so I don't know if it's good to unleash you.
No matter how bad things are, someone always wins, and figure out who's going to win out of the bad scenario. I think it's a key point.
There you go. That, of course, is Gabriel, but of course, Hugo Kruger, writer, analyst, commentator, and really an engineer out in France. Always nice to have him on, guys. I really hope you all enjoyed these gentlemen on this particular show as I get them off the screen, with a big thanks to all of them, and a big thanks to you for watching this and another episode of Liberty and Friends here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. If you really like this content, guys, please, I really encourage you, support the show financially. I'm looking to do some really amazing things this year, and there's a lot of people looking to back me in that particular regard. I'm in Joburg at the moment, trying to scout for a studio that we're going to start broadcasting from. Guys, when I say to you there's some interesting things coming, there's some really interesting things coming. Let me keep quiet. But as always, I'm wholly dependent on you. So please, guys, as little as 50 to 100 Rand a monthly contribution really is beginning to, it's showing dividends. But of course, if you can't do that, just hitting that like button is more than enough, and sharing this content. Thank you so much for helping me create a channel that you can enjoy every Sunday here on the BDL show, Liberty and Friends. I'll see you on Wednesday for the Big Daddy Liberty show. Until then, as I always say at the end of every show, never trust a commie.